Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is all roads lead to Denerim in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. 121. Quality time in Fort Draken. All in all, the arrest and processing went just about as well as both of them expected. A sham investigation, followed by a swift march to Fort Draken, the removal of most clothing, although, given that no less than 7 hidden knives and assorted thieving tools dropped out of Finn's clothing as they did so, it may have been warranted, and a push into a mutual cell. Percy leaned against the bars, trying to get a bearing of their situation. At the least, the others would have gotten away with the rescued prisoners, including 3 that could be of use at the land's meet. Including his brother. Maker, he wasn't sure how to process that. Fergus was alive, when Percival had been certain, for months, that he was the last living Cowsland. It was something of a relief, actually. Once Fergus had recovered, he would be able to take over however as Tairn. Percival certainly had no intention of returning to that castle full of ghosts. Fergus. Maker. But, no. It didn't bear thinking about at the moment. The land's meet loomed near, and 2 of the 3 operative wardens were imprisoned. Obviously, Loghain was going to make absolutely certain that they stayed here, but, in Percy's mind, that was out of the question. They needed the win at the land's meet. Capable as he was, Garrot wouldn't be able to wield the influence among Ferelden nobility that they needed to win. That meant either waiting for outside rescue, which, knowing their companions, he had little doubt would be coming, or expediting matters with an attempt of their own. Except that Finian didn't really seem up for any daring feats of trickery at the moment. Percy turned to watch the elf, who had spent the last half hour since being imprisoned pacing restlessly. It was probably the most disconcerting aspect of this whole ordeal. Finian Tabri was visibly upset about something, and making no attempt to smile or shrug it off. Well, Percy had been waiting for the chance to have a good sit-down with Finn, and the Maker had certainly provided one. Percival was beginning to think that the Maker had a very twisted sense of humor. Finn. The elf responded with a distracted hum. And continued pacing. Percy sighed and stepped forward to place a hand on Finn's shoulder. Rather than stilling, Finn jumped, and spun wide eyes full of barely suppressed panic. This was no bout of mere nerves. What's wrong? Oh, sorry. Finian pulled away, flashing one of his fake smiles. It's nothing. Finn. Just a little restless, you know how it is. Haven't jumped on enough dragons lately. Finn. Finian sighed and looked away. Sorry. I don't do well with cages. Small surprise, after what happened at the alienage. Finn shook his head and moved to the back wall of the cell. It's more than that, he breathed, sliding down the wall to sit with his head resting on his knees. I've been imprisoned before. It's not a good memory. Percy couldn't really say he knew what being imprisoned felt like, but having one's self-control slip without one's volition? That, he knew. He leaned back against the bars, peering at Finn across the cell. I suspect it says something that you gave yourself up despite that, then. Finn croaked a laugh and lifted his head. Tell me, was this a monumentally stupid idea? What, surrendering? A nod. Not as much as you'd think. I've fought Ser Catherine before. We likely would have been subdued regardless. That drew a real chuckle out of him, at least. My bardic senses are telling me there's a story here. You've fought her. Dueled her, actually. She would certainly have loved to put me in my place today, I'm sure. He let his head fall back against the bars in memory. It was during Kaelin's wedding, when all the noble households were in Denerim in force, and she was this shiny new thing Loghain had following him around. She was one of the fiercest, strongest women I'd ever seen, and so, of course, I made attempts to woo her. She was insulted to the point of kicking me into the nearest trough. When I suggested a duel in an attempt to impress her, she only accepted reluctantly and then went on to absolutely trounce me. My brother swore it was one of the funniest things he'd ever seen. Percival Cowsland, the great charmer. I enjoyed a challenge. He shook his head with a smile. That one simply proved a bit above my abilities. They fell into companionable quiet, with Finn's fingers tapping against his knee as the only indication of his continuing restlessness. Last time, the elf said quietly after a while, the cell was smaller. And darker. This is a little better. I assume it helps that there's a half-naked man in here with you. Finian laughed, and that was enough for Percy to shove down any lingering discomfort. What happened? Percival ventured, if you don't mind my asking. Finn's smile was self-depreciating, but honest. I got caught. You? And you didn't manage to talk your way out of it. Well, it was kind of hard to convince people I hadn't been sneaking in and sleeping with the son of the house when the guards turned me out of the bed themselves. I was still struggling to come up with a believable excuse when they dragged me, plumb naked, to the family dungeon. A family dun, this was a noble family. A memory of a scandal a few years back struck him. You mean Aiden Roselund? You were the elf that got him sent to Orlais. Finn shrugged. I didn't send him anywhere. What with being shoved into the family dungeon? Maker, how did you get out? After a couple days, my alienage Haran intervened and sprang me through good old-fashioned bribery. His eyes went distant and sad. And now he's in the hands of Tevinter slavers. Hey, you can't do anything about that now. I know. Finn sighed. It was all my own fault, anyway. You know how it is, with elves and nobles. Percy felt something cold go through him. No, he said firmly. That was entirely Ban Roselund being an ass. Being noble is no excuse for treating good people any differently merely because of a difference of race. More quietly, he added, no matter how well-intentioned such things might be. Finn smiled up at him. Is that an apology? It's been months. What do you think? Finn's head hit the back wall as he chuckled. Well, if it helps, I should apologize too. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. Percy shrugged. I'd be something of a hypocrite if I faulted you for flirting, wouldn't I? If you want, we could start over. Wipe the slate clean. You know that doesn't really work, right? Percy gave the elf his best arched brow, and Finn grinned in return. Besides, it is the mistakes and tragedies of the past which shape us. Erasing them is as good as moving backward, when we should always be looking ahead. Look at you, all wise. When did that happen? Personally, I blame Marnan. They settled into silence again, which meant that, a few minutes later, they both heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Percy looked out through the bars and saw a set of 6 guards emerging over the staircase, flanking a bony hawk of a man wearing a blood-stained apron. He could immediately guess what this man was here for. This wasn't good. Percival pointedly placed himself on the other side of the door, glaring defiantly at the small man as he stopped on the opposite side of the bars. Usually, we give our guests time to settle in, the interrogator said. But the regent is so very eager to learn what you know, we all thought it a grand idea to begin as soon as possible. Percival stayed silent, and Finian made no noise behind him. Now, this will be simple. We can do this the easy way, which involves you telling me the locations of your co-conspirators and the confession of your crimes against the crown. Or we can do this the longer, more painful way, in which you tell me the same thing through a newly cleaved tongue. What do you say? You'll get no such thing regardless, Percy snapped. The interrogator sighed. They never choose the easy way. He motioned to his guards, and 2 opened the door, while 2 more came in to secure Percival. The noble tensed and flexed, intending to make this difficult for them. No. The guards about to manhandle him paused. The elf. Percival turned, watched them scoop Finian up from his spot on the floor, and the noble was alarmed to see that the elf had gone completely limp, his expression distant. The interrogator gave Percy a slick, poisonous smile. They say this one likes to talk. Let us see just how silver his tongue really is. Percival swallowed his worry, because he could do nothing against 6 armed guards in his skivvies. He could only watch them drag Finian away, the elf's limp heels dragging on the floor. And then, just before they rounded the corner, Finian's eyes met his, one of them closing in a slow wink, and a hint of that patented impish smile tugged for the briefest moments at one corner of his mouth. Percy slumped against the bars, just breathing and daring to offer a prayer to the Maker that the pair of them would get out of this with bodies and minds intact. 122 arose by any other name. He and Khazar were stuck sharing a tent, and wasn't that just peachy? Down in the tunnels, they had managed a couple hours of walking, once the others had held a little service for the fallen blood mage. Leliana led it very sweetly, considering she'd barely known the guy, and, when Khazar was asked to say a few words, he just shook his head. Alistair just kept a respectful silence through the thing, because wow. Sacrificing his life? For Khazar? Just, wow. And through it all, he couldn't help but imagine how angry Tegan and Eamon would be that Jowan escaped justice, and that they had the gall to be tardy about it too. It made him want to giggle, and that was wrong of him, so he bit his cheek and kept his silence. So, once that was done, and Felicity had one last go at Alistair's injuries, his shoulder still throbbed where the demon had dislocated it, they gathered their stuff, ignored the angry taint song in their veins, and started the long journey back to civilization. They got a couple hours of walking in, and then they found a side chamber to sleep in, and then they continued the next day, and the next, until they finally broke out into the surface air. And, on a chilly mountainside, they made camp, and Alistair had to share a tent with Khazar. It wasn't as bad as it might have been. Throughout the journey from Red Cliff, Felicity had accounted in the minute detail she was incapable of not putting into things what, exactly, Khazar had been like the past few weeks. It took Alistair a while to figure it out, but he eventually realized she felt guilty for not noticing the change, and no amount of "it's not your fault" from Alistair convinced her otherwise. So it was a little unnerving, just how quiet and thoughtful Khazar had become. Sure, he wasn't acting like his demon-possessed version, that was the point of the whole creepy blood ritual. But he was also not acting much like the Khazar Alistair remembered from before that. The arrogant little prick who slung fireballs into friend and foe alike. This Khazar was muted. Pensive. He would even say guilty, but that couldn't be right. Still, Alistair could kind of see why the girls wanted to baby him. Especially when Alistair ducked into the tent that night after dinner, mostly to escape cleanup, to see Khazar already bundled up in the blanket, apparently cold even though it wasn't really that chilly this far down the mountains. Alistair paused in the entrance of the tent and frowned. "Did you eat?" The elf mumbled something into the pack he was using as a pillow. It didn't sound like a yes. Alistair sighed and stepped into the tent to start divesting his armor. After a minute, Khazar raised his head to stare at him through narrowed eyes. "You're not going to drag me out and stuff food down my throat?" Alistair paused in unbuckling his chest plate. "You want me to?" "No." "Good." He got back to what he was doing. Khazar stared at him, and Alistair was working on his greaves by the time he spoke again. "Why not?" He dropped his hands, because he didn't really want to be talking to the mage when his hands were anywhere in the vicinity of his pants. "Why not what? Why aren't you bossing me around? I would have thought you'd be glorying in it." Alistair blinked over at him, confused. "Glorying? Why would I be glorying?" "Because you were right, dumbass." Khazar flopped back down into the covers. "You were a perfect little Templar who was right the whole damn time, and I was just a stupid mage who got mixed up in things over my head, and I should have been made tranquil a long time ago." "I never said that." "Did I?" "It was implied, moron." Alistair just blinked down at him, trying to make that make sense. Yeah, he didn't particularly like the tetchy twerp, but that didn't mean he wanted to turn him into one of those empty, soulless things. He thought about that while he worked off the last of his armor, leaving him in his undertunic, which could use a run through a river, to be honest. Finally, he asked, "Did you learn your lesson? What, are you Felicity now? Are you going to consort with demons again?" Khazar sat bolt upright, wearing a sharp, insulted glare. "Of course I'm not going to consort with demons again, you nitwit. What do you take me for?" Alistair kept himself from rising to the bait. "Good. Then you learned your lesson, and there's no reason to hound you about it." Khazar studied him with narrowed eyes. "I was an abomination. How could you not? You don't care. All that crap about me being out of control before, and then I let a demon in and you don't fucking care." "Of course I care." Alistair sat down on his bedroll. "But it's done, and, all things considered, it could have been a lot worse. I was a demon. Right. A powerful one. And you know who you used that great scary power on? Alistair held up 2 fingers. Flemeth, and the Archdemon. After a pause he added. Granted, only one of them stuck, and I don't really think she's dead, but they were both set back a bit, so that's a good thing. Really, you didn't actually hurt anyone, when you could have pretty easily leveled a small city. I killed Jowan. No. No. That's not true. Jowan killed Jowan. He did it to save me dash. Because he cared about you, for some reason. Felt guilty as all get out that you'd gone the way you had, and he wanted to do his part to fix it. Alistair played with the edge of his sleeve. I couldn't stop Isolde from doing that for Connor, either. Khazar was silent at that, and when Alistair looked up, the elf was looking down at his hands. I'm sorry, the mage said. About the Connor thing. We jumped into it too fast. Alistair sighed, because he'd had time to think about that, too. No, you just did what you thought was right at the time. If Finn and Mila backed you up, I have to assume there was reason for it. But if I'd been more prepared, I wouldn't have. Khazar swallowed. When he looked up at Alistair, he was biting his lip uncertainly, and that was a weird expression to see on the elf. Connor's demon isn't dead. I'm sorry. Yeah, we kinda figured something like that. The deal was that she would come back, years from now, to reclaim Connor. That was what she got for teaching me blood magic. Alistair nodded thoughtfully. Well, could Connor learn to shut her out by then? If he's trained at it. Probably. She wasn't particularly strong, not like Mouse was. If he's properly prepared, maybe. Then that's what we'll do. Khazar stared at him. You're being really calm about this. It's creepy. Alistair shrugged. So are you. Maybe we both grew up a little bit, huh? Khazar snorted and laid back down. Lies. You're never gonna grow up. Did you just call me childish? And how old are you, again? Khazar stuck his tongue out at Alistair and rolled away, and it really was like having an obnoxious little brother. The strains of a lute sounded outside. It sounded like the girls were settling down for a bit of campfire time. An evil little thought curled into Alistair's head, and he grinned. Khazar seemed to sense it, because he looked over his shoulder at him and said, No. It'll be good for you. Alistair pushed himself up. No, it won't. No. Don't you dare. Ignoring his protests, Alistair scooped Khazar up and slung the elf over his shoulder, carrying him ogre-style out of the tent into the little campfire. The ladies laughed as they emerged, and again when Alistair plopped Khazar onto a makeshift log bench and the elf assumed the most epic of pouts. Can't have family bonding time without the obnoxious little brother. It's good of you to join us, Khazar, Leliana said diplomatically, tuning her lute. Mila, beside her, was working on fletching new arrows. Felicity, meanwhile, was in the dirt in front of the fire, sorting herbs that she had been collecting all day into piles. Alistair took a seat on the ground next to her. The grateful smile she sent him was worth the trouble, at least. I've got one you might know, Leliana said, and started singing what Mila assured them was a Dalish children's folk song. Apparently, Mila had been telling the truth, because a little smile lit Khazar's face, and he was rapt as the two archers wove harmonies together in Elvish. A small, warm hand wound into his, and Felicity leaned into his shoulder. We heard what you were talking about just now. Note to self, tent walls are not soundproof. She jostled his shoulder. Thank you, for giving him a chance. Alistair shrugged awkwardly. Felicity gave him one more smile and went back to work. Alistair watched over her shoulder, listening with half an ear as the Dalish song ended, and Leliana started teaching the elves a call and response sea shanty. So, Alistair whispered, what are you doing? Making sure my ingredients are holding up. They will be less efficient if they begin to rot or flake. Alistair hummed in understanding. He'd listened to his fair share of herbalists at the chantry over the years. He furrowed his brows. Is that a peony? I've never seen that used as an ingredient. I'm not surprised, it is not traditionally used among the chantry and the circles. So. Morrigan. She nodded. Morrigan was kind enough to teach me a number of her mother's home brews. Honestly, they are often more effective than the traditional ones, if perhaps a bit more volatile. Well, that matches Morrigan perfectly. Doesn't it just? Felicity beamed at him, and he got that mushy feeling deep down again. He pursed his lips, because there was something he'd been sitting on for a while. And this seemed like as good a reason as any to bring it up. What about roses? Are there any secret uses for roses? Roses? Not that Morrigan mentioned. Oh. Okay. She looked at him curiously. Alistair. Why do you ask? It's nothing. It's silly. Forget I brought it up. She nudged his arm playfully. Don't give me a mystery, Alistair. You know I'll always pursue a mystery. He laughed, because, yeah, she had a point. All right, all right. You caught me. One moment. He pulled away from her, even though he didn't really want to, and stood up, then padded over to his tent. He didn't really need to dig to find it, he'd wrapped it in a scarf a long time ago. He took a moment to himself, listening to the soft, sweet song that Leliana was singing, and he just breathed. His heart was pattering, and butterflies alighted in his stomach. He ran his thumb gently over the stem to soothe it. This was silly. She'd think he was an idiot. Well, she'd find out eventually, right? Might as well give it a shot. With a calm resolve he usually reserved for the battlefield, he made his way back to the campfire, his prize cradled carefully in one hand, and knelt back down next to her. That is a rose. Right. Yep. Certainly is. She watched him expectantly. I picked it in Lothering. Because it was so amazing to me, that such beauty could exist in a place of such misery and fear. I've kept it as a reminder that even during disasters, life and beauty will find a way to live on. Her eyes sparkled in the starlight. Alistair, that's beautiful. He tried to look away before he said something stupid. While we were looking for the ashes, it reminded me of you. Too late. Alistair. I mean, the whole beauty in darkness thing, it's like you. You find learning and insight in the bleakest circumstances. Cataloging a darkspawn breeding grounds. Anyone else would have been too terrified, or creeped out, or whatever, but you sat there and you took notes, because you knew that what you were learning would add to future knowledge. It's amazing to me that you do that. And now I'm babbling. Shutting up. He dared a glance at her, her eyes were shining. Oh Maker, he'd made her cry. His awful metaphors had made her cry. But then she was scooting around until she was kneeling in front of him, and she wrapped her arms around his shoulders and drew him down into a kiss. He couldn't get used to it, how soft and warm and sweet she was. They'd kissed lots of times by now, traveling together as they were, but most kisses had been fast and consoling. This one was fond and leisurely and meaningful. When they pulled apart, he had to clear his throat before he could speak again. So. Right. That's why I was wondering about whether you wanted a rose. Because you can have it, if you like. She sat back, and he thrust the rose out for her. You can use it for potions. Or whatever. However you want. I'd just like you to have it. She took a while looking between Alistair and the flower, all while Mila sang something soft and sweet in Elvish in the background. She reached out and carefully took the rose. She studied it with the focus that only she could pull off, fingers gingerly brushing the dried petals. Alistair swallowed, because this wasn't how she usually handled an ingredient. This was how she handled something precious, like an old book or artifact. Thank you, Alistair. This means a lot. It did. You've put up with so much, and still you're so kind, and smart, and wonderful. I just... His tongue tied itself in knots, and now she was crying and smiling. I just thought you should know that I care about you. A lot. You're the best thing that's happened to me. She sniffled, hiding her mouth and nose in the hand not holding the rose. The sentiment is mutually reciprocated. He blinked. Wait, you mean you feel the same? She nodded and grinned, and he just had to reach out and sweep her up into another kiss. She launched into it, and he let the momentum overbalance him and send them both to the ground. The rest of the world faded away for a while, because he had an armful of warm, happy mage, and that was the most important thing in the world right now. Seriously, get a room. Khazar's taunt reminded him that, oh, right, they weren't exactly alone. He sat up, face hot. A glance at Felicity showed her dark blush as well. If you wish, you may use ours, Mila said matter-of-factly. Alistair opened his mouth, but no words came out, and his brain didn't seem capable of producing any. Fingers threaded through his own, and he suddenly didn't mind the catcalls much. He turned to Felicity, who was smiling up at him with something new in her eyes that sparked something hot in himself. Well. He mumbled, and he knew his face was red as a tomato. Would you want? I mean, would that be okay? Her duskier skin didn't show her blush quite as just wasn't fair. Oh yes, I think that would be quite okay. He smiled, squeezing her hand as she smiled back. Okay. Awesome. Slowly, she drew him up onto legs that had gone a bit wobbly and, their hands linked, led him out of the firelight. Back at the campfire, Leliana launched into an Orlshian love song. 123 No one escapes from Fort Draken. Finian wasn't the kind to keep his mouth shut, especially in stressful situations. If he tried, he knew he would break. So, instead, as the first heated prod burned into his flesh, he talked. He spoke about Denerim merchants, and babbled about dagger fighting techniques, and sang folk songs, and recited bits of the chant, and guessed at what the different spots on the ceiling were from. Every moment they stretched him, and burned him, and cut him, and broke him. An endless string of meaningless words flowed from his tongue, so that by the time they shoved a potion down his throat to heal a round of injuries to start over, his voice was hoarse. Then, once the interrogator, Godard de something Orlesian, tired of his voice, the guards dragged him back to the cell and dropped him at Percival's feet, and Finn let himself break down just a little bit. He was afraid. So, very afraid. Dragons, darkspawn, blood mages, those he could take. But this? He couldn't breathe in here. He couldn't think. There was only the sickening terror of walls closing in on him, and the sheer helplessness of it. Sometimes, they took Percy away, and Finn was left to listen while things down there sizzled and creaked. But each time, Percival retreated into a rage where he couldn't feel the pain, and they never got anything out of him except a handful of growls and a few landed punches. When they dragged Percy back, the nobleman was always tight-jawed and seething, but strong and proud against their techniques. They were getting bolder, though. And both wardens knew that, when one of them broke, it would be Finn. It was his 5th, 6th time being dragged up out of the torture area. They'd dislocated and then reset his shoulder at some point, so that ached, and he had a fresh line of cuts down the sensitive flesh in his side. They had also discovered his old thigh wound from Ostagar, and had taken a hammer to it, turning the muscle to jelly. Thus, when they threw him bodily into the cell, it wasn't purely acting that had Finn collapsing into a heap on the cold ground and curling into a ball. Percy, bless him, leapt at the door just as they banged it shut, the human letting out a growl. Finn watched from the floor as Percy glared such death that the guards hurried to retreat out of sight. It sent a spark of that old warmth through him. The elf closed his eyes and concentrated on the weight in his closed right hand. He sighed in relief. They hadn't noticed. There was hope. Finn. How do you feel? Strong arms scooped him up, and Finn leaned into the warmth, letting the contact soothe his nerves. He opened his eyes, only to be caught by piercing blue. He wished they were honey brown. He offered his companion a shaky smile. How long do you think we've been in here? Percival's mouth pressed into a thin line. I can't say. 4 days. Want to get out? Percy's brow furrowed in confusion, and Finian grinned in earnest, presenting his closed hand. It took some help to actually unclasp his pain-stiffened fingers, but when they did, Percival smiled. Can't keep your fingers out of people's pockets, even here. It really is something of a problem. Gingerly, Percival took the keyring and hooked it onto his wrist. Then, he stood up, levering Finn onto his feet. After a brief fight with vertigo and an aching leg, Finn managed to stay upright. We'd better move quickly, the human said, before the guard notices it's gone. Finian nodded in agreement and followed Percival to the door. The nobleman managed to crane his arm around and get the key in the lock, and the cell door clicked open. Finn suddenly felt like he could breathe again, and the nasty, jittery feeling he'd been fighting for days slowly ebbed. Now, they had a course of action, namely, escape. Finian took the lead as they slipped out of the cell, his lighter footsteps silently padding through the corridors. They found an armory, and gladly suited up in the latest guard fashion, complete with helmets and basic iron weapons. Then, they headed back out, walking past guard posts and patrols, toward Finn's best recollection of where the front door was. Shortly after that, an alarm bell started pealing throughout the prison, and Finn could feel Percy thrumming with tension as the prison became not unlike a stirred nest of hornets. Guards hurried to and fro. Finian wasn't sure what tipped their hand. Perhaps there was some prearranged signal for such an event. Perhaps Percy's acting needed work, or Finian was still too obviously an elf, even in armor. Maybe it was a lucky guess. Whatever it was, there was a shout from the main corridor ahead of them, and a half-dozen guards were suddenly barreling at them. Percival planted his feet and met them with his borrowed greatsword, while Finian dove out of the way of the charge. Finn rolled back to his feet and moved behind the attackers, only to have something wrap around his neck from behind. A whip, or belt, or something, whatever it was, it yanked him backwards and into a metal-plated chest. Finn's helmet was whipped off and his arms pinned by more hands. Even as he fought to draw his daggers, he missed his spring sheaths. He was well and truly pinned against one of the guards, and the hateful, awful interrogator appeared from his side, eyes glinting with dark amusement. This would not end well. One of the Godart's long hands slid to his throat, tilting his head back, and someone put a sword to it. "Put down your sword, young Cousland, or the elf gets a second mouth 6 inches below the first." Percy froze mid-swing, and one of the men he was fighting bashed him back with his shield. The sword pressed into his throat, and Finian could feel how dull and nicked it was against his jugular. Getting his throat cut open by such a weapon would hurt. Slowly, Percy turned to face the interrogator, his sword lowering. Finn tried to shake his head, to signal that this was obviously a bluff, like they'd kill the one who might actually talk, but his head was being held too steady. The great sword clattered to the ground. Good. Now, the armor. There was hesitation, and the blade moved against his neck. Finn felt a warm trickle down his collarbone. Piece by piece, Percy removed the stolen guard armor, his jaw tight and face shuddered. He practically threw the last piece, the gorget, onto the stone. "Good boy," Godard sneered. "Now, it is pretty clear that we have been affording you far too much leniency. Boys, why don't you take the young lord back to his cell to cool off?" Percival stiffened, eyes betraying concern as they flickered to Finian. "Worried about your elf pet? Good. Let's see him pick any more pockets when I've cut off all his fingers." That threat wasn't a bluff. He didn't need his fingers to talk, and so Finn couldn't help but jerk against his captors. One of them punched him in the gut, and he fought not to double over, since that would shove a sword into his throat. "Take him back downstairs, boys. He's obviously up for another round." This time, when they took him away, there was anger in the eyes of the man who would soon be holding the implements of torture. Before, they'd been focusing on coercion. Now, they'd be actually trying to hurt. Finian did not have to pretend to be terrified. 124 Ambush. Mila was scouting ahead, as usual, as the party made their way along the northern edge of the Bristolian forest, where the terrain was peppered with ridges and dips alongside the path. That was when Fang growled softly, and she paused and took the time to study her surroundings, taking in every out-of-place shadow and mislaid blade of grass. Someone was nearby, multiple someones, hidden among the trees and in the dips and rises of the land. She could hear the others behind her, bantering amongst themselves, and she debated going back to warn them, but such an action would reveal her position to the beings lurking in the trees. Whoever these people were, they were certainly already aware of the other wardens. She noted the broken branches of a few trees where the newcomers were lying in wait, and it led her eyes up to a few figures hidden, but not very well, among the foliage. All watched her companions raptly as the wardens approached. It was to be an ambush, then. Mila was almost amused by the attempt. Shemlin had no idea how to lay a proper forest ambush. She decided not to speak to her fellow wardens just yet, especially as the other wardens moved closer to the trap, completely oblivious to the danger. Instead, she warned them in the best way she knew how. She climbed silently onto a ridge above the prospective ambush site, drew her bow, and shot one of the ambushers right out of the tree above the wardens. The body landed with a thump right in front of Alistair. The reaction among the wardens was immediate, banter ceased, weapons sprang out, and a shielding aura surrounded the foursome, all while the attempted ambushers were still figuring out what had just happened. Too late, they sprang out of their cover and attacked, only to be met with lightning and steel. However, this was no simple bandit attack, easily dispatched. That became quickly apparent as multiple armored Cunari rose from the bushes around her companions. Mila took aim from her position on the ridge, but before she could fire, Fang let out a growl at something behind her. The Dalish elf turned her attention around to see a pair of subtler attackers rising out of the foliage to meet her, both bearing twin blades. Her bowstring sang, piercing the chest armor of one, then the other. Unfortunately, their equipment was made of good, reinforced leather, so her arrows did not pierce as deeply as she was used to, and the attacks kept coming. She was forced to slide back along the ridge, skirting close to a 10-foot drop that would have her at the mercy of the ambushers below. As she circled around the pair to keep them at her front, she drew her bow to fire a third arrow, but one kicked out and hooked a foot through her bowstring. The bow went spinning out of her hands, clattering into a tree behind the attackers. Mila jumped back as the other attacker attempted to take advantage of her sudden disarmed status. Fang sprang upon him, bearing him through a shrub and out of Mila's immediate vicinity. Mila drew her hunting knife to face the other attacker. Her opponent carried a pair of short swords, which he put to use in a flurry of blades. Mila jumped back again, one foot kicking a scree of pebbles down the ridge. Mila attempted to dive and low for an attack, only to miss and feel the bite of steel in the back of her shoulder. "Surrender, strangers, and you won't be harmed," yelled an unfamiliar voice somewhere above the fight. "We just want to kill the little redhead girl." Khazar could be heard scoffing, even as he shook the ground under an archer on a ridge above the wardens. "Which one?" Mila dodged back to escape another flurry of swords, and one foot slipped off the ridge. She snapped a hand out as she dropped, catching a root on the edge to arrest her fall. Her opponent stepped up the edge of the ridge above her, smirking down at her. Then, Fang emerged out of the bushes to launch himself at the back of her attacker's knees, tearing through the tendons and sending them both off the ridge. The human slid down with a shriek, and landed hard on the ground below her. Mila left the man to the white wolf and pulled herself back up onto the ridge to retrieve her bow from where it had fallen. She did a quick check to ensure that it was unharmed, then peeked out of the foliage to get a look at how the others were doing. The last of the Cunari was menacing his companions with a great sword, but then fell to a well-placed lightning bolt. With a bit more searching the area, she spotted the man who had spoken. He was standing up on a ridge opposite the ambush site from hers, separated from the wardens by a short, but steep, cliff face. Beside him was a spellcaster, though she kept stumbling, unable to get a spell off under Alistair's barrage of smites. Mila knocked an arrow, but didn't even have time to draw it back before a different arrow appeared in the leader's chest. So, instead, Mila turned her bow to the witch and loosed, her arrow piercing the enemy spellcaster's throat. The leader was still alive, but weakened by the arrow sticking out of his chest plate, judging by the way he stumbled back to brace himself against a tree. The man made to turn and disappear into the forest, but Khazar blasted the ground under the enemy with his staff, and a tangle of vines sprang up from the forest floor. The mage made a pulling motion, and the newly entangled man yelped as he was yanked right off the cliff and moved to dangle 3 feet in the air in front of the wardens, held in place by a net of vines. "You didn't answer his question, you know," Alistair said, wiping off his sword. "That's just rude." Mila hopped off the ridge to join her companions. "Did you mean me?" Leliana asked. "You're after me?" "Why?" Mila added, pointedly not removing her arrow from its string. The man eyed them all. He may have been looking down at him, but it was obvious who had the advantage here, especially as Khazar pointedly juggled lightning between his hands. "Don't rightly know," he said slowly. "I just got my orders. Kill that little redhead girl, the rest are up to you." Don't think he knew more than that either. Against Leliana, Alistair asked, sounding shocked. Why would anyone want to kill a sweet girl like her? Leliana said, looking nervous. Mila remembered speaking with Leliana about this, about the guilt the bard carried with her everywhere. Mila refused to let this ghost of the past dog the human, and so raised her bow and trained her aim on the mercenary. The man's eyes widened in fear. Wait, don't, Leliana said, and Mila held her aim steady, but did not fire. He is a mercenary sent to kill you, Sadisolan. I know. But I need to know something first. The bard took a breath and stepped forward to stand in front of the man. Who sent you? His eyes flicked to Mila, and he swallowed. Don't know. Wasn't given a name. Mila drew her bowstring back an inch. But I do have an address. Where I was supposed to receive the rest of my payment. Will that be enough? Leliana nodded, and the man rattled off an address in Denerim. Thank you, Leliana said. You can let him go now. Khazar snorted. The last assassin we let go ended up getting stuck to us. Even so, he waved his staff, and the vines dropped the mercenary with a thud. Mila kept her bow trained on him, even though her arm ached with holding it back as the man picked himself up and cast one last nervous look around. Then, he scurried out of sight. Only then did she relax her arm. Felicity was the one who broke the silence, with a concerned, Leliana? Are you all right? The bard nodded, but Mila saw a tightness to her jaw that she did not like at all. Leliana was not supposed to be hardened. This was unacceptable, and would need to be rectified immediately. Yes. But there is something I must tell you all. Tell us on the way, then, Alistair said. Because we've got a door to knock down in Denerim. Leliana's grateful smile helped ease Mila's anxiety over this entire situation. It did not, however, make her want to shoot that mercenary any less. 125 Garat Broska's Flying Circus. 4 days. It took them 4 days to put their plan in motion. Had Finian been leading the operation, it would likely have taken half that. His warden was ever one to jump in with half a plan and a hunch, and had it been their stalwart Kaus land commander, they would likely have been bursting through the door in one, and damn the consequences. But, no. They had Garat, and the dwarf was ever careful and particular. He was a trapper at heart, planning and predicting to the last detail, deadly in his precision. At any other time, Zevran would have sat back and appreciated watching a master at work. But not this time. They had 2 wardens in prison, and it had taken them 4 days before Broska was satisfied with the preparation. It was unacceptable. Even so, Zevran waited, using the time to stock up on his poisons and hone his blades until they could cut a hair in half the long way. He and Morrigan entertained between themselves the possibility of simply storming the place, but they were both practical enough to see the foolishness in that. They would be of no use to their wardens if they were locked in the cell beside them, after all. But then, finally, the dwarven warden was satisfied, and they headed for Fort Dricken in a small, garishly dressed group. That was to say, the others were garishly dressed, while Garat and Zevran ghosted behind the group in much more sensible leathers. Okaren led the strange procession, dressed in a flow of colorful silks that hid a suit of chain armor quite nicely. Behind him walked Wynne, with Finian's lyre slung across her back. They had managed to get Hugo to sit still long enough to paint him, though not without some rather convincing pouts on the Maberry's part. Finally, there was Sten, in Barbarian gear and sporting a mask that hid most of his true nature, holding a, purposefully weak, chain with a bear on the other end. Morrigan had let out a few rather impressive curses when she found out she would be playing the part of a dancing bear, complete with fluffy skirt for comedic effect. Of course, when Garat had revealed her part after that, she had calmed down. Okaren played his part with an amusing amount of gusto, declaring boisterously at the gates that they were the Belen brothers' circus, and that they had been hired by an anonymous guard to surprise the prison warden for his birthday. The 2 gate guards were too amused to give more than a cursory questioning, and their attention was too focused on the troop to notice Garat and Zev stepping up behind them and giving them each a good dose of soldier's bane. They dropped immediately, and the 2 rogues dragged them around to a concealed corner of the wall. They had timed it so that the shift didn't change for 2 hours. With a little luck, no one would even notice them missing. They continued to follow the troop, who were proving to be a very effective distraction. Dwarf and elf flitted between shadows with expert finesse, but it was to the point where Zevran doubted that they even needed to. A bear in a tutu proved to be quite the effective distraction. The others turned down a corridor toward where their maps had shown the warden's office to be, and the two shadows broke off in the other direction, toward the cells. Zev could already hear Okaren shouting his lines with much aplomb, while Wynn struck up a few chords on the lyre. Circle Tower classical training had proved quite handy, in that respect. They would likely have only a few minutes before the warden tired of the show, and Morrigan was forced to move on to the next phase. Hopefully, they would have their wayward wardens by then. They had debated at length about the merits of trying to pass as guardsmen for this operation, but in the end, it had boiled down to the fact that no one would find an elf and a dwarf believable as guardsmen, and they both fought better in leathers anyway. Thus, they were sneaking in the fun way, slipping through the hallways like ghosts and pricking each guard they came across with a dash of soldier's bane for an impromptu nap. That had been Wynn's suggestion, not killing the guards outright, but poisoning them. It took a bit more finesse to pull off though. When it came to things like this, Zevran had little but finesse but would prove far more beneficial to their cause in the long run. Best not to kill 100 of Ferelden's soldiers right before trying to woo Ferelden to their side, and all that. There were shouts behind them, followed by the distant sound of a bear's angry roar, and Zev spotted a flash of Garot's grin. This would be the next phase of the distraction, then, and the most important one. An angry bear getting loose in the halls would be most dire a situation, after all, calling guards from all kinds of posts to capture it. Especially if that bear managed to barrel down a particular corridor that ended in a hidden three-way split and then somehow disappeared. Why, the entire garrison would be searching that part of the prison for a large furred form, and paying no attention to a pair of shadows on the complete opposite side of the prison. The pair of them slipped into an armory and waited behind a stack of crates as footsteps rushed past to go help take care of the situation. They stayed there for a minute or two, waiting for all the guards to leave the wing that would. A light scurrying sound rounded the doorway, and a small, rabbit-like rodent skittered into the room. Garot chuckled. "Have fun, did ya?" The creature chattered crossly, and Zevran tilted his head. "What is she, exactly?" "Nug." Or Zamer's answer to the lack of common pests. Zevran twitched a smile. "And yet, I have seen much worse being used as household pets in Antiva. Come on, should be clear now. We're almost to the high-priority cells." Garot stooped and offered his arm, and Morrigan climbed up onto his shoulder. They headed out of the armory, still taking care to hug the wall. It was largely unnecessary, as very few guards were left on this wing of the prison. They came to one row of cells, then another. Sometimes, they were occupied by bleary-eyed convicts. Other times, they were occupied, but not by the living. Still, none proved to be their pilfered wardens. It was to be expected, they had read in the intercepted reports that the two were being kept further down. For ease of questioning. Zevran could only bite his tongue at that and keep moving forward. Finally, they rounded a corner and saw their golden Adonis of a commander, stripped to his small clothes and watching their approach expectantly. Zevran could not help a hum of appreciation. The man really was quite an exquisite specimen, though his skin had been marred with myriad newly formed cuts and bruises. Morrigan changed back to human form without even alighting from Garot's shoulder, and the dwarf let out a grunt as she shoved off him. She strode up to Percival and settled before the cell, her arms crossed. "Well? What do you have to say for yourself?" The warden's face was a hard mask. This was hardly a change, from what Zevran had seen, but he would have expected something like imminent rescue to at least make him crack a smile. "I'm not going to apologize for turning myself in, Morrigan. Then you have obviously gone soft in the head. Perhaps we should leave you in here, as it appears you do not appreciate the hardship you have put us through." The noble arched a brow, and Zevran had to chuckle. "Allow me to apologize, then, if I worried you." "What? Worried?" Morrigan sputtered. "Who said anything about worry? I merely meant the excruciating inanity of the dwarf's so-called plan. Hey, it's working so far, ain't it?" Garot, while they spoke, had broken out his picks, and now set to opening the lock. "Now we just gotta find the elf." Percival's face fell, immediately and totally, and Zevran's stomach dropped. "Where is said elf?" Zevran asked, forcing his voice to stay light. "They took him down to the, down." Percy crossed his arms and nodded down the corridor. "They took him." Zevran swept off down the indicated corridor, the dwarf's cries of, "Hey! Wait!" following him unheeded. It wasn't a long path, passing a few more cells before it terminated down a set of stairs into a torture chamber. Zev cast a glance around and his blood ran cold. His warden was strapped to a table, blood flecked all over his bare skin, particularly around his hands, where the fingers had been mangled beyond recognition. The warden's eyes were unfocused, and he appeared to be mumbling something, judging by the movements of his lips, but the blood was rushing too loudly in Zevran's ears for him to hear it. For there was another person in the room, a human in an apron standing over the elf, holding a serrated saw to his warden's throat and looking up at Zevran with expectant glee. "One more step," the man's voice said over the rushing in his ears, and the warden dash. Zevran threw his dagger with better precision than he ever had before, and the interrogator's words were cut off as it lodged in his throat. The man spent a moment gagging in reflex, and Zevran pressed his advantage, leaping upon him with cold fury. He sliced with his sword at the same time that he yanked out his dagger and ducked into a spin behind the human. Deftly, he stabbed a very particular spot in the man's back, severing his spine, and the human's legs collapsed out from under him. He was a heap on the ground, the saw forgotten as he clasped at the puncture in his own throat. "Now, muerto, let us not be hasty," Zevran purred as he crouched over the man, drawing the tip of his sword lovingly along the edge of one of the human's eyes. "In fact, let us be very, excruciatingly slow." He dug the tip in, just enough to scratch the eyeball, to sting. He leaned down, tapping the man's chest with his dagger. "Your tortures are effective enough, I'm sure, but allow me to extend to you my generosity, and teach you all the best methods of extracting pain, straight from Antiva." He cut through the cloth of the man's blood-splattered apron, smiling coldly. "A truly generous offer, from one tradesman to another, don't you think?" "Zev, don't." The cracked, warbling voice from the table paused the movement of his blades, but he dared not take his eyes off this scum. "Do not fret, Amor. I am merely going to give this man the death he deserves. A long, lingering one. Please, Zev. I just want to go." The broken note in his lover's voice tore his gaze from his quarry. The others had arrived, and Garrot was working at releasing the cuffs that bound the elf to the table. Morrigan had pulled out a couple poultices for the more grievous of his wounds, while Percival manned the door. All the while, Finian's eyes stayed on Zevran, and the exhaustion and fear in them was completely unmasked. His warden had been stripped bare of his honey through pain, and still he asked mercy of the man who had obviously done that to him. Zevran's heart ached, and he turned back to the interrogator, who was still helpless beneath him. With a sigh, Zevran stabbed in and upward with the dagger, neatly piercing the man's heart. "The things I do for you, Amor." As he stood up, Finn tried to smile, and that just hurt to see. Zevran came to his side, studying his lover's bare form. With each new scar and laceration, he could only grit his teeth and regret that the man dying behind him would not be afforded a slower death. The hands were the worst thing, the interrogator had set to them with intent, breaking every finger at least once, pulling off fingernails, burning the palms. Zevran ran a finger gently along his warden's wrist and tried not to show how worried he was that the other would never be able to play that silly little liar of his again. Garrot released the bonds with a victorious grunt, and Finian immediately tried to sit up, only to pale and keel over immediately, one arm crossing a bruise in his abdomen. Zev leaned in to support his warden's flagging body. "He cannot walk like this," Zevran declared, a voice in the back of his mind cataloguing his lover's injuries with cold precision. "Morrigan, can you heal him? I've done all that I am capable of. The old woman will be far more suited to this task than I. Then we must take him to her." He fretted for a moment, wondering whether he'd be strong enough to transport his warden, much less as quickly as necessary not to draw the guards down upon them. "I can carry him." Zevran's head snapped up. Kausland had his arms crossed over his broad, bare chest, and something in Zevran quailed. "I've done it before." Reflexively, Zevran cradled his warden a little tighter. Then, a mangled hand touched his arm, and his warden said, "Zev." A single syllable, but full of something that soothed and reassured him enough to nod, just once. Percival stepped forward and moved to the opposite side of the table. Gently, Zev ran past Finian's hunched form to the larger man, who carefully shifted him to lay in his arms. Even that had the elven warden biting back hisses and winces, but there was nothing for that. Then, they all started out the door. Before he left, Zevran afforded one last kick to the interrogator's corpse. Just because. 126 returning victorious, kind of. The first one to greet them, as they ducked through the servants' entrance of Arleman's estate, was Hugo. The dog bounded up to them, painted with a combination of greens and oranges that was absolutely garish, and Percival resolved to later ask Garrot what in the maker's name the dwarf had been doing with his dog. For now, though, they had a destination, as evidenced by the familiar weight curled up in his arms. They'd wrapped the elf in a blanket. Finn was simply too swollen to be able to fit into anything else right now. "Hugo," Percy said. "Find Win." The Maberry barked happily and jetted off through the estate's halls, and the four of them followed behind at a trot. Percival himself was barely holding on to his reaction from the experience, the need to thrash and scream and kill the bastards who had done such awful things to him, but this helped. A comrade in need kept him focused and grounded. They turned into the great hall, where their other companions appeared to be reporting to Eamon. Fergus stood off to one side, near Tegan and Riordan, and was that Anara? Percy felt a spike of rage, but he recalled his friend in his arms, and kept control. "You're back," Eamon said, a relieved smile breaking across his face. Percy ignored it, more focused on the elderly mage standing near Sten and Okaren. What were they all wearing? Ugh, no matter. Win, Finian requires healing. Win's brows rose, but she nodded. Very well. Bring him to his guest room, and I will tend to him as best I can. She started off in the indicated direction without further hesitation, and Percy followed. Percival, we've much to discuss about the land's meat, Eamon said. Later, Eamon. It must be addressed as soon as dash. Later. Percival, this cannot wait. He stopped in the doorway and spun to face the older noble. No, this cannot wait. One of my wardens is down, Eamon, and that takes priority. Ergo, we will discuss politics later. Not waiting for permission, he stormed down the hallway, Garrot's appreciative chuckle trailing behind him. Zevran slipped ahead, helping Win turn down the bed that the elf had been using during his stay. Gently, now, Win said as Percival laid him upon it. She hummed thoughtfully as she took in his battered form, paying special attention to his mangled hands. Finian, for his part, reached out to Zevran, who met him halfway, and the look they shared was far too private for witnesses. After ensuring that Win had everything she needed, Percival left. The others had gathered in the corridor outside, Garrot, Okaren, Sten, and Morgan. Hugo licked Percy's hand. He rubbed his eyes tiredly. Can anyone explain why Anara is here and not at the palace with her father? Garrot shrugged. Switched sides. Again. 'Tis apparent she did not wish to be at the mercy of her father at the moment, Morgan corrected. A sentiment I can certainly understand. As can I, given recent events. Percival sighed. Very well, let us go discuss politics an hour after escaping prison. If you want, boss, I can create a distraction so you can escape. Percival allowed a smile at Garrot's offer, the tension to easing out of his limbs. Tempting, but I'm afraid duty calls. He paused. I think I could do with a bottle of wine, though, once this discussion with the wayward queen is over. Garrot chortled and saluted. Coming right up. He bobbed off and Okaren trailed after him, never one to turn down a trip to the wine cellars. You don't trust her, Sten's voice rumbled once they had turned a corner. Percy sighed and allowed himself to lean back against the wall. I don't know her. Kaelin was always the bright, flashy one everyone paid attention to. Anara was always much subtler, and I never paid much attention to her the few times I encountered her before. Morgan arched a brow knowingly. Come now, Percy replied to that expression. She was the queen. Even I knew she was off limits. Good, Morrigan said disdainfully. As far as I'm concerned, that woman is too crafty by half. Percival found himself relaxing. I find I'm rather fond of crafty women. He arched a meaningful look at her, making her scoff with little bite. That is because you are a fool. She paused, and a smile quirked her lips. Although I must say I approve of the way you dismissed the old Arl just now. He's not going to let me hear the end of it. No, I suspect not. Morrigan turned to him, and set about dusting off the tunic they had found for him during their escape. As she straightened his collar, she met his eyes with a meaningful look. However he reacts, remember that you are the one in control here, not him. He only means to settle the civil war, Morrigan. All in aid of your endeavors against the Blight, which means you are in charge. What is more, you are a far better man than he. He jerked back, surprised to hear such words from her, and she tugged him back and continued fussing with his collar. Don't fight, 'tis truth. And I will personally strike down any man who would claim differently. The last of his tension left him under a rush of gratitude. After everything he'd done, what he'd been before and what he was now, he could not express what it meant to hear those words. Thank you, Morrigan. Why thank me? 'Tis fact. She stepped back and crossed her arms, and he wondered if Sten would mind if he pinned her against the wall in front of him. Perhaps later, over that bottle of wine. Duty first. Percival drew himself up and took a breath. Very well. Let us go. He started down the hallway, Morrigan and Sten in tow, to do battle against the likes of Arleman. Not for the first time, he envied Marnan, that she didn't need to deal with this anymore. 127 obstructions and complications. About a day's walk out of Denerim, they hit a roadblock. This was a literal one, a barricade erected across the road where it went through a narrow ravine, so that they would have to backtrack several hours to go around. The dozen men in their path were dressed in the colors of Loghain's men, and, judging by the way they all stood and drew their weapons as the five approached, they recognized the party as wardens. Stop and turn back, in the name of the regent, one of the men snapped. You've got to be kidding me, Alistair grumbled. Would it help if we asked nicely? Said pretty please. We have orders direct from Loghain to intercept any suspicious figures who might sabotage the land's meat. You are suspicious. Turn back. Sabotage? Are you serious? Felicity laid a hand on Alistair's arm and sent a calming spell through him, and he gave her a look. I do not think they will see reason, Leliana said, too softly for the soldiers to hear, and the wardens all gathered in to speak amongst themselves. They are obviously working out of Loghain's pockets. If we do not turn around, they will fight us. Let them, Mila said. We will meet them blow for blow. I don't know if you've noticed, Mila, Alistair said, but they outnumber us 2-1. We've handled worse odds. Right, and someone always gets the stuffing kicked out of them in the process. Usually me. So, no, I think I'd rather take a couple hours out of my day to go around them. Felicity shook her head. I doubt that will do much good. At Alistair's questioning look, she explained. It's a barricade, obviously set here to stop us and our supporters from entering Denerim. Loghain is a tactician, he would not have set just this one block, but rather a perimeter. All paths leading to the city will have the same results. So we're stuck. Alistair sighed. I can't believe I'm saying this, but, Khazar, do you feel like blasting our way through? Khazar, who had remained quiet through the exchange, it would have been strange, once, but it was the case more often than not since the demon, turned to regard the barricade thoughtfully. I could make a path. That's an awful lot of steel coming at us, though. Seeing their attention, the leader of the soldiers cleared his throat pointedly. Are you done? Doesn't seem it should be that hard a choice. Well, that settles it, Alistair whispered with a snort. On my signal. They all nodded and broke apart, approaching the barricade. Felicity kept tight to Alistair's back, suspecting he would need the added support of her magic if he was going to make a target of himself. Which, being Alistair, he always did. It is a little bit difficult, Alistair said, not seeming aware of the bows raised in his direction from behind the wall. We were trying to figure out whether you were really being paid that much, or whether you're just stupid. You see, we're Grey Wardens, and that gives us political immunity to just about everything Loghain can throw at us. That means you've got no grounds to touch us, and doing so could mean trouble with Weishaupt. And trust me, no one wants trouble with Weishaupt. The leader faltered. You're bluffing. Nope. Also, fire. A fireball and scattering of arrows burst from behind them, and a section of the wooden barricade burst into flames. The soldiers were quick to react. The half with bows released their strings, but Felicity timed a concussive burst around her and Alistair that bounced them away. Then, the soldiers bearing melee weapons charged, and Alistair ran ahead to meet them. There were times when Felicity had to fight down the urge to see Alistair as a knight in shining armor. He was far from perfect, after all, and there was usually too much dried gore on his armor to make it shine. And yet, at times like this, when he charged into impossible odds to protect his weaker companions, Felicity couldn't help but think that this was the sort of man that people wrote fairy tales about. Felicity? Oof. Little help. Well, excepting the constant string of batterings and injuries, anyway. She set to doing what she did best, healing a hammer blow here, an arrow wound there. She stayed tight to Alistair's back, and the warrior did a commendable job keeping them off her, though she did need to release the odd spirit bolt to discourage them. She had been paying so much attention to Alistair and herself, however, that she lost track of how Khazar and the archers were doing. She hadn't even been aware of soldiers slipping past Alistair's front line until the soldiers still standing backed off, everything brought to a standstill. Felicity had to peer over Alistair's shoulder to see why. The leader of the soldiers, half of his face burned off, much to Khazar's credit, was holding his sword to Mila's throat, the elf pinned solidly against another soldier's chest plate. Leliana and Khazar were frozen with indecision, bow and staff quivering respectively. You should have turned around, he said. You can't kill her, Felicity blurted, moving to scurry around Alistair, but his hand snaked out and grabbed her upper arm, keeping her safely back. Legally, you can't. This is a land's meet, our two forces are under truce. Tell that to the men you just killed, he sneered. You attacked us first, nitwit, Khazar said. Lightning raced up and down his staff, but he did not seem able to fire. That is not the story my men will tell, once you are all dead. We'll start with the dirty knife ears. Khazar's magic flared disconcertingly, so that the enemy soldiers nearby could be seen shifting in discomfort. Say that word again, he dared, and Felicity froze as she heard a low dissonance in his voice. What's the matter? Don't like being reminded of your inferiority, knife ears. The soldier smirked, pressing the blade in. Mila did not flinch, but Felicity saw the blood it drew. Useless moochers, all of you. You were better off as slaves. Leliana hissed, how dare you? She could not see Khazar from where she stood, but Alistair and Felicity could, and Felicity could feel his grip on her arm tighten as he registered the sight of the red aura at the same time she did. Red cracks of light spread across the younger mage's skin, and though she could not see from her position, she suspected his eyes were glowing equally red. This couldn't be possible. Had another demon found him? Or had the same one regenerated and come back for more? The leader of the soldiers, at least, had the good sense to look worried by this development. He stared at Khazar. Stay back. Better off as slaves. Khazar said, and there was definitely a demonic dissonance in his voice. Let's see a slave do this. He threw his arms out, and the ravine around and above them started rumbling and groaning. The ground shook, throwing the human off Mila, and the Dalish promptly twisted and extricated herself from her captor's grip. Despite the trembling, Leliana's arrow pierced the leader's eye, and that instantly broke morale. As rock dust rained upon them, the other soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. Alistair's jaw was tight. Felicity, how stable is the ravine above us right now? What? If I smite Khazar, will it hold? Felicity blinked, surprised Alistair had thought to check. Then again, given the near cave-in down in the deep roads, they were all aware of Khazar's destructive power. She looked up above them, studying the sheer rock faces above them. A couple cracks, but nothing substantial. It should hold. Alistair nodded and reached out a hand, and Felicity felt the pulse of a smite around Khazar. The elf stumbled and fell, the red light immediately flickering out. Felicity and Alistair approached cautiously, and she noticed that Leliana and Mila stayed back, watching the younger mage warily. Alistair did not even let Felicity get too close, stopping her 4 paces from him as the elf got his hands and knees under him. Khazar. Felicity tried. What was that? Khazar gasped at the ground. We were about to ask you the same question, Alistair said tightly. Khazar looked up, his eyes wide. I didn't, it's not. He swallowed and sat up on his knees, and his frightened eyes sought and met Felicity's. It was me. He dropped his head into his hands. It wasn't a demon, it was me. Alistair held Felicity where she was, but that didn't stop Mila from kneeling down beside Khazar and laying a comforting hand to his back. Mila. Alistair said warningly. I think he's telling the truth, Felicity posited carefully. He and the pride demon were very tightly entwined. We managed to extricate him, but it may be that it could not be a clean break. They were all looking at her questioningly. She took a breath to collect her thoughts. Think of it like this, Khazar and the demon were 2 different ingredients, say Khazar was a seed and the demon a leaf. They were ground up with a pestle and poured into one pot, then boiled in water to create the new creation, the abomination. What we did in the Fade was essentially run the potion through a sifter to separate the bits of seed from the rest of the potion. However, the fact remains that the seeds remain ground up and cannot be rebuilt, and the essence of the leaves was given time and treatment to soak in, and cannot be removed without destroying the seeds altogether. You're saying, Alistair said, that parts of the demon soaked into Khazar. I'm saying that there are bits of him that may have been mixed too tightly to truly separate. We did what we could to distinguish them in the Fade, but some of it may have been irreversible. Khazar swayed where he sat, pale. So there's no way to get it out? I'm going to have these pieces of demon in me forever. Felicity bit her lip and nodded, scrambling to come up with something to comfort the boy, but unable to devise a solution. Khazar's head dropped back into his hands, and he started tugging on his hair. I thought it was my imagination, that I was remembering the pride demon, but it's me? I'm never getting away from it? Fuck. Khazar. Felicity ached for him, wanting to fix it, but no amount of knowledge or magic could. Some things, once broken, could not be returned to the way they were before the break. Alistair took a breath, and in a more soothing voice than she would have expected asked, Khazar, we need to know. Is this dangerous? I don't know, the elf mumbled into his wrists. I don't want to hurt anyone, but if I'm part demon. A very, very small part, Felicity said quickly. It's still a demon. Khazar was shaking, but a soothing string of Elvish from Mila had him raising his head and looking at all of them. Alistair, if I transform, or something. You've gotta just take me out, okay? I don't want to be that thing again. Alistair nodded his head gravely. I promise. Then, after a pause, he cracked a wan smile. But only if you really, really deserve it. Don't think you're getting out of stopping the blight that easily. Khazar's laugh was broken, but existent, and Felicity took Alistair's hand and squeezed it gratefully. He squeezed back. We'd better get moving, Leliana said after a few moments of pensive silence. The ones that ran away will tell their superiors about us. They all pulled themselves together. Mila helped pull Khazar to his feet, and Leliana retrieved his twisted staff. Felicity, for her part, did not remove her hand from Alistair's, even as they resumed their journey down the road. 128 The rounds. Every morning, Wynne spent an hour brewing potions. While the water boiled, she catalogued her ingredient stores, just to ensure she had enough to care for the entire estate. It was a large estate, and a good many people needed her support, even if they weren't aware of it. Wynne smiled as she bent to take 2 of the kettles off the fire. One, she poured in a bowl with powdered deep mushroom. The other, she stirred in with elfroot paste. She hummed softly to herself as she worked the paste in. As an ache sprang up in her wrist, she took a break, pulling the 3rd kettle off the fire. Finally, once she had all that morning's necessary supplements gathered together on a tray, she took up the tray and headed out for her rounds. Her first stop was Okaren's room. The small guest room stank of whatever cheap spirit the dwarf had been into the night before, and Wynne dutifully placed the hangover reliever onto his bedside table. It didn't entirely cure the man's ails. She wasn't about to condone the man's excesses, but it would take the edge off. If there was one thing the wardens didn't need, it was an irritable Okaren adding to their cumulative stress. She slipped out as softly as she'd come in, with the dwarf none the wiser, and headed for the next room on her mental list. She passed Garot's and Morrigan's, and knocked on Sten's. A grunt from inside bid her enter. The Cunary was up, unsurprisingly, and eyed her as she came in, affording her the same guarded wariness he extended to all mages. She only offered him a warm smile and set the replacement for his disinfectant at his feet, as he was undoubtedly getting low. The Cunary did not often speak up about his ails, but the experienced healer could tell that the bear's claw marks from their prison charade 3 days before were bothering him still. After a moment considering the bomb, he nodded to her. "I thank you." "You're very welcome," she replied with a smile, and left. Next, she took a hallway toward the back of the estate, toward Eamon's personal study. Already, she could hear arguing from down the hall. "Appreciate the necessity, I can hardly tie myself to a man I've never met. The bands would have a field day. You cannot expect them to simply accept an untried stranger into the fold." Wynne settled outside the closed study door, picking up the appropriate vial from her tray. "I am certain, my queen, that if you vouch for him, they will accept him." "If you vouch for him, you mean?" A sigh. "Honestly, Eamon, I'd rather take on one of the Cowslands. They, at the least, are familiar faces to the court. I'm afraid that is rather out of the question. One is mourning his late wife and son yet, so marrying him would certainly not be proper at this time. The other is a warden. So is Alistair. Trust me, my queen. When you see him, you will understand why I do not believe an unfamiliar face will be the problem." Anara's voice sighed again. "Very well. I will withhold judgment, for the time being. Do not think this is the end of the discussion, Eamon." "I would not dare presume, my queen." Footsteps neared from within, and the door opened. The flustered queen stepped out, rubbing her head. Wynne proffered the headache cure she had prepared. "At it especially early this morning, I see," Wynne said with a light smile. "Thank the Maker. You, madam, are a lifesaver." Anara downed the vial in one gulp, then replaced the vial perfunctorily on the tray. "It's always a constant tug back and forth, with Eamon. It almost makes me miss letting Kaelin deal with him." Anara started down the hall, and Wynne followed a respectful distance behind. "Something tells me, my dear, that you were the one making the actual decisions, even then. Not all of them. Merely the ones that mattered." She sighed, but Wynne could see by the set of her shoulders that the queen's constant stress headache was easing. "Would that I had spoken a bit more sternly against sending to Orlais for help, and my father would never have been driven to this. Do not let your regrets rule you, dear. They are there to learn from, nothing more." "I would disagree with that. They are there to correct. We will fix this, one way or another." Anara nodded a thanks to Wynne and turned off down a small hallway, and Wynne continued on to the dining room. When she entered, it was into an awkward silence. The source was easy to spot. Fergus sat at one of the tables, picking at a breakfast of eggs and cheese. Percival stood some distance away, his arms crossed stiffly and his mulberry looking fretfully between the two. They had been staring at one another in silence, but they both looked up guardedly as Wynne walked in. She paid no mind to the thick silence, heading straight for Fergus. She set his daily potion on the table in front of him with a stern look. He should have known better by now than to try to eat without his digestion potion a necessity until his stomach could process whole foods properly after his long captivity. Fergus smiled wanly in return. She turned to the younger brother. "And how are you feeling this morning, Percival?" "Well, thank you," the young man replied stiffly, his eyes flickering to his elder brother once. "Your burns aren't bothering you further? I seem to recall you scratching them last night over dinner." He shook his head. "Morrigan gave me a balm for them." A flicker of a smile flashed in his eyes. "Said she found my incessant shifting irritating and suspicious." "I see." "Brother," Fergus began. "Don't, Percy snapped, smile instantly gone. You don't know her, and you don't know me. Fergus' mouth snapped shut, and he turned to stare down at his breakfast. Wynne sighed, but pressed her lips together and let it be. Percival already knew her opinion on the matter of his brother, and he would relax and rediscover the relationship only with time. Until then, this tension would hang over them every time they shared a room, and there was nothing much that Wynne could do about it. And so, she nodded farewell to the two of them and headed to the kitchen, putting a bowl of cooling porridge on the tray, along with some meat and cheese. Riordan, she found in the library. The older warden was hunched over Felicity's codex, delivered by Brother Genitivy some days before. The man was always far too wan and tired, in Wynne's opinion, but she could detect nothing wrong with him other than the same oily taint that plagued all the wardens. He was simply aged by his experiences, it seemed. He smiled gratefully as she delivered her other batch of balm to him. Most signs of his imprisonment were healed, but a few lingered on, and those few could mean the difference between victory and defeat, if the archdemon arrived tomorrow. This is really not necessary, but I appreciate it, he said in his light Orlshian accent. These are trying times, Warden. Each of us must help in our own little way. Rest assured, yours is more helpful than most. Thank you. She accepted the thanks and turned to head out, winding through the corridors to her final destination. Both elves were up when she arrived. Finian nestled comfortably back against Zevran while the latter held a book in front of them. Judging by the way they were sniggering, and the way Zevran snapped the book shut as she walked in, the contents of said book were not fit for polite company. She suppressed an eye roll and instead sat on the bed at Finian's feet, offering them their breakfasts. It was reassuring how Zevran always ensured Finn had his food before he took his own, though she would certainly never point the habit out to him, lest she inadvertently dissuade him from it. While they ate, she reached over and began her daily checkup. First, she reached up and tilted Finian's head to the side, taking a look at the pickpocket's ear and its new gold hoop. She had been rather miffed, the day after the escape, to walk in and find that the pair had pierced Finian's ear overnight without telling her, but it seemed Zevran had known what he was doing, as the puncture had shown no sign of infection thus far. Satisfied with that, Wynne turned her attention to the thief's hands, taking each in turn and carefully running a magic-imbued finger over each healing break. They were still stiff and weak, but they would heal correctly, and that was more than could be said if Wynne hadn't been here. She had spent all of that first night tending to the boy's hands, only satisfied once her magic was exhausted that she'd done everything she could. She had felt her spirit slip a little closer to death that night, but she knew that it was for a good cause. These wardens were destined for great things, after all. Once satisfied that the hands were healing well, she did a cursory check on the rest of him, knitting torn muscles and punctured skin a bit more every day. He would always have scars, but, again, he would heal to full functionality, and that was more than many who had gone through his experience could say. Well, healer. Finian said around his porridge. What's your prognosis? That you should know better than to speak with you mouthful, she chided with a smile, and both elves chuckled. She offered them a smile. I think, perhaps, you may be ready to leave your bed today. Finian lit up at that and reflexively moved to try to get out of bed, but Zevran held him down. The ant of Anti-Sked. Not before you finish your food, Amor. Finian slumped back into the other elf's arms, pouting. Fine. You're as bad as my father. Warden, I have met your father, and you know I am not above fetching him and bringing him here for a proper dose of familial guilt. You wouldn't. He craned his neck to peer at Zevran. All right, you would, but please don't. He'd have a heart attack if he knew I was sent to Fort Dricken. Then I suggest you do as the beautifully bosomed healer says, yes. Wynne sighed. Really, Zevran? He winked over Finn's shoulder, and she fought a fond smile. She would not encourage this. Carefully, she stood, spending a moment to stretch her aching joints. Rest for now. I will be by around lunchtime, and we will perhaps experiment with a bit of movement then. Finn sighed. Alas, it seems I am sentenced to a couple more hours of bed rest. Whatever will I do to fill the time? Zevran smirked, trailing a finger down Finn's nightshirt. I can think of a few things. Bed rest, boys, Wynne said sternly. Even so, she turned and left them to their own devices, a bit against her better judgment. At this point, she trusted Zevran to be attentive enough not to injure Finian outright, and she had to be content with that. With a final sigh, she took her now empty tray and headed back for her own room. 129 brothers and sisters. Riordan wasn't sure what to make of the new recruits. When he'd first been released, he'd been impressed, though not without reservations. On the one hand, they had been able to break into and then out of a hostile, heavily guarded estate. On the other hand, doing so was against the self-sacrificial philosophy of the wardens. Then again, Riordan still had difficulty processing the hostility that the Feraldans were showing to their ancient order. Only the dwarf had returned from the Howe estate that day, and he had immediately thrown himself into the task into freeing his comrades from imprisonment. Thus, Riordan had been forced to watch him from afar. The young man was certainly competent, as could be expected if Duncan had been doing the recruiting, but certain things about the way the dwarf acted made Riordan hesitant to approach him with his suspicions about the recruit's lack of education. And so, he busied himself with other things. He discussed the details of the civil war with Arleman. He caught up with Fergus Cousland, who remembered him a bit from Highever, and they spent a long evening telling one another stories about his parents. He asked around for details about the blight where the Darkspawn had hit, where they were moving, whether the archdemon had actually been seen, but news outside the city walls proved sketchy at best, and prone to fearful exaggeration at worst. Finally, 3 days in, the kindly healer, Wynne, left for an afternoon and returned with none other but the infamous Chantry scholar, Brother Genitivi, following. The scholar presented Riordan with a very large, bound and loose-leaf book, declaring it to be notes borrowed from one of the warden recruits. The pair of them spent most of the afternoon deciphering the myriad maps and entries, and only managed to skim the surface of the information bound within. The scholar was kind enough to leave the book with Riordan, claiming that he had learned all he would from it without discussing it with its true owner. After some time studying it, Riordan admitted that he shared the sentiment. Garrot Broska left and returned, bringing the 2 other recruits Riordan had met with him. The elf was best left to heal, but the younger Cousland sought him out. It had been a tiring conversation, young Percival recounting in bitter detail what, exactly, had happened at Ostagar, and what they'd accomplished since then. They had discussed the merits of sending to Weishaupt for more wardens or using their allies now. Riordan had revealed the existence of Duncan's stash, and Percival had described what they'd found upon returning to Ostagar. Overall, an informative conversation, but exhausting. The elf, Finian Tabri, was up and moving around with aid some days later. He, however, was more interested on whatever Eamon and the Queen were planning than what Riordan had to say. Riordan left the elf alone for the most part. It was fairly apparent that Percival was the one calling the majority of the shots, anyway. And so, he found himself in the library the day before the lands meet with Percival and his hound, the pair of wardens positing ways to draw the archdemon to a tactically beneficial position once it was spotted. Riordan was discussing the possible ways to ground it when a servant popped her head in and announced that the other wardens had been spotted entering the city. Percival immediately abandoned their discussion, tearing off for the front hall with his dog at his heels. Riordan followed at a calmer pace, entering the main hall to the gathering household. It appeared that word was spreading throughout the estate. Percival was already waiting up front with Eamon and Bantegan. Broska stood back with his companions, the other dwarf, the Cunary, and the apostate, and was joined shortly by Wynne and the elves. Anara and Fergus entered behind Riordan and took a portion of wall near him, and he could hear them deep in discussion about Highever. Riordan cocked a curious ear. It had been his home at one point, after all. They were discussing plans for Fergus to resume the estate, it seemed. Young Lord Cousland looked tired about the entire thing, but they both seemed committed to the importance of seeing a Cousland sitting back in the Terranship after the death of Rendenhow. All conversations were cut short as the front doors opened and a small party, led by a tall, blond man, stepped briskly through. The blond man's steps skipped a beat as he took in the large audience waiting for him, but then a sideways smile appeared on his face, and he planted himself in front of Eamon with a semi-sarcastic salute. The 4 behind him weren't quite as upbeat. The robed woman at his shoulder cast sharp, curious eyes around the assembled household. A pair of archers stood behind them, which Riordan was glad to see, as that may be the only way to bring the archdemon to the ground. The human archer smiled to the assembly, but the Dalish archer's visage was hard and guarded. Trailing behind them was another Dalish, small and robed, and with his gaze firmly trained on the floor. Eamon's face broke into a broad smile. "Alistair. You're just in time. You know me. I didn't want to miss all the fun political stuff." "Woohoo." The other wardens quirked smiles at that, including Percy. Tegan, however, was frowning as he scanned the party. "Alistair, where's Jowan?" Eamon's face fell, and his brow furrowed as he, too, scanned the group. "He, Alistair said. Didn't make it." Tegan frowned, stepping down from the dais. His eyes locked on the robed elf in back, and he scowled. "It was you, wasn't it? You let him escape." Riordan didn't miss the twin reactions from the elf, a flinch and the clench of a fist, but the elf didn't look up. The band took another step toward him, but the reaction among the newcomers stopped him. They moved to block his encroachment, protecting their comrade. Riordan fought a smile at the evidence of solidarity. Alistair stepped smoothly in front of Tegan, his face hard. "Khazar didn't do anything like that. Lay off." Riordan couldn't help but notice a few raised eyebrows at that, and Wynne seemed to be biting back a smile. Tegan appeared to be taken aback. He glanced up at Eamon, who said, "Alistair, perhaps you'd better explain, then." "He's dead." That was the accused elf, Khazar. His voice was soft and cracked. "I killed him." "Delithalan," the other Dalish said firmly. Khazar shook his head, gaze still trained on the floor, but Riordan could see his knuckles turning white even from afar. "I have to go, out." He spun on his heel and, keeping his face hidden from the assembled audience, made for the nearest side door. As soon as he left, Braska broke off from the wall and slid out after him. Alistair was now regarding Eamon sternly, his arms still crossed. "That was unnecessary." "He's clean, then?" Eamon asked, equally stern. There was a brief hesitation while he and the robed woman shared a glance. "Alistair." "He's clean," Alistair said. "You know I wouldn't have brought him back if he wasn't." Eamon pursed his lips. Percival stepped forward. "It's good to have you all back, then." Alistair's grin cracked again. "Well, look at you, all diplomatic." "You certainly aren't going to be," Percival deadpanned, and Alistair laughed. "True, true. So, what's with the welcoming committee?" Alistair waved his arms to encompass the hall. "Who are all these people?" "Zev, he doesn't remember us," Finian said in a stage whisper to the Antivan. "Do you think he's a spy in disguise?" "Doubtful, Amor," Zevran returned. "I doubt even the best bard in Orlais could replicate that lollygag hangdog look of his." "Hey. That is very true," giggled the human archer, who, Riordan couldn't help but notice, sported an Orlesian accent. A cursory glance revealed a lute strapped to her back, and Riordan made a mental note to watch her for actual hints of espionage. He had spent the last decades in Orlais, after all. Percival cleared his throat, and the wardens and companions settled down. Riordan nodded to himself, confident now in his assessment of young Cousland as the emergent leader. "Here. You no doubt know Eamon's household, Alistair. Other present parties include Her Majesty Queen Anera, my brother Fergus, and Riordan, a warden sent from Orlais." Riordan bowed a greeting as his name was listed, only to look up and find the robed woman studying him with intent. He gave her a gentle smile, and she pressed her lips together. "Your brother," the Orlesian bard said. "How wonderful." Percival nodded stiffly, and Fergus could be seen shifting uncomfortably. Alistair, meanwhile, stared at Anera as one would a poisonous asp. She met his gaze steadily, and that only seemed to make the man balk more. Finally, he broke his gaze away and turned to address the bard behind him. "Hey, Leliana, let's go do that thing now." "Alistair," Eamon said warningly. "Just a couple more hours, Eamon, I promise. There's just a few heads we need to bash in while we're in town." Tegan was rubbing his head. "And you don't think that may be bad for our image the day before the lands meet?" "Can't be worse than killing Howe in his own home," Finian said with a shrug. He started to step toward them, but Zevran pulled him back. I'm fine, the elf protested. MMHM. The Antivan deftly prodded a thumb into Finian's side, and the elven warden doubled over. You will stay here and rest. I will help them take care of it. Zevran moved to join the archers, both of whom were turning to head back out. Finally, some action, Okaran grumbled, hurrying to follow them. The witch peeled out of the shadows. I do get weary of this place, she agreed. The five of them headed to the back of the hall, but waited by the door for Alistair. He was stopped by the robed woman whispering a few words to him. She motioned once to Riordan, and he nodded with an indulgent smile. Then, ignoring the protests of Eamon and Tegan, he turned and left, taking the companions with him. Once the door closed behind him, Eamon dropped his head into his hands and rubbed his temples. I'd forgotten how vexing he could be. You were certainly correct, though, Anara said thoughtfully. He looks exactly like Kalen. Just don't expect him to handle like him, Your Majesty, Finian said. He had recovered from the rough handling, and now leaned back against the wall with a thoughtful smile. I'm sure Felicity could give you some pointers. The human woman's dark face flushed. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Finian. The elf sniggered, and Eamon frowned at the implication, but let it be. The woman, Felicity, swept past him anyway, heading straight for Riordan. He gave her a friendly smile as she stopped before him. You are a warden from Orlais. I was stationed in Orlais, yes. Originally, I am from Ferelden. She nodded to acknowledge the statement, but breezed on. Will more forces be coming? I am afraid not at this time. I was a scout who was captured until very recently. If I sent for more now, it would be far too late, for they would not arrive in time. Again, a brisk nod acknowledged the news. I have an urgent question for you, then. Oh? I am at your disposal, sister. She blinked at the address, then glanced around. It is perhaps best if we discuss it in private. I understand. Come, then. Riordan motioned for her to follow and took a good steps toward the hallway he'd come from. He noted a brief exchange between her and Percival, wherein he moved to follow, and she stopped him with a shake of her head. Interesting. He led her back toward the library, which was all but deserted. As he stopped over the table he'd been working on, Felicity paused in surprise. My codex. Ah, you are the warden who kept these notes, then. She nodded. I have to say, I'm impressed. Not many could have discerned this much detail in a life-or-death situation. She shrugged uncomfortably. If I do not record such things, who will? It's our best way of helping future generations. Of that, I agree. He settled to lean against the table, and she idly flipped through Riordan's own notes on the other side. Now, what was your question? Oh, of course. She dropped the notes and looked up to regard him sternly. She had very expressive, observant eyes. Riordan could easily see the intelligence and drive that had made her create this book. How are we to kill the archdemon? He nodded to himself, because that confirmed his long-held suspicions that the wardens hadn't been told the true nature of their connection with the Darkspawn. He supposed that it was to be expected with the new recruits. Most of the ones who would teach them had died the day after their joining, by Percival's account. But Alistair, he should have perhaps been told. It was a fault of Duncan's, brash in some things, but very, very cautious in others. I take it, he said carefully, that this is no idle curiosity. She shook her head and sighed. We just came back from the deep roads. We'd previously encountered the archdemon there, in the dead trenches. Yes, I do recall reading that. Well, one of our mages, Khazar, attempted to head back there and kill it. Riordan raised a brow at that, but she shook her head, denying further explanation, and moved on. He veritably caved the entire cavern in on it. Physically, it should not have been capable of withstanding the weight. Any simple dragon would surely have been crushed. And yet, it did, so much so that it was able to break out of the crush and fly away. How is it that it survived? Riordan hummed thoughtfully, because he could see the lack of knowledge where her confusion stemmed. Let me guess this, were there other Darkspawn around? Oh yes. Thousands. Nearer than the mage was? Or any of you? We were on top of a tall trench. The archdemon and a veritable army were at the bottom when he caved it in. Both Reardon's brows went up. He caved it in upon a horde? It may not have killed the archdemon, but that will certainly have brought down their numbers substantially. But how? How did it not kill the archdemon? Riordan sighed, and kept his voice low, in case of eavesdroppers. I would suspect that one of the darkspawn at the bottom of the trench survived. It would only take one. She furrowed her brow in confusion. There is something that it seems Duncan did not tell you about the nature of the Grey Wardens, sister. It is not a happy truth, but it is a necessary one. I can handle it. That, I do not doubt. He tapped the codex thoughtfully. Do you know why the Grey Wardens are necessary to defeat the Darkspawn? Because we can sense their presence, correct? Because of the taint in our blood. Yes and no. While it's true that the taint in our veins makes us suited for finding pockets of Darkspawn, there is a greater reason for it when it comes to the Archdemon. You're saying the taint is necessary to destroy it? Yes. And then, he leaned forward and told her, voice barely above a whisper, and watched her eyes get wider and wider. She had questions, of course. About the mechanics of it. About whether any tainted thing could absorb the archdemon like that. Even about how this property had been discovered in the first place, during the first blight. Riordan answered the questions as best he could, all in whispers, and admitted that, as the oldest warden present, he would traditionally be the one chosen to make that final blow. She pursed her lips and nodded solemnly, seeing the logic in it more than the self-sacrifice. By the time they were done, it was nearing dinner, but neither of them had much appetite. And, as Grey Wardens, that was saying something. 130 partners in crime. The kid liked tall, out-of-the-way places, so the first place Garrot went was up on the walls. He spent a couple minutes walking the facade, then one of the Red Cliff guards posted up there pointed him over the balustrade. Sure enough, he got up on his tiptoes to peer over the divider and spotted the elf about 7 feet down, sitting on a gargoyle jutting out of the stone. The elf was staring out over the water of the bay halfway across the city, one hand tracing patterns on the gargoyle's stone head. Garrot huffed quietly, but nonetheless pulled out his spare rope. He tied one end around his waist, then looped the rope around a rail in the balustrade and climbed over it. Carefully, he rappelled down the facade until he was even with the elf. Khazar cast him a mutedly amused look. I could burn your rope right through. You'd drop like a stone. Yep. Garrot settled against the wall, finding a semblance of purchase against a narrow lip in the rock. The elf turned back to look out over the city, his eyes following ships coming in and out of the harbor. Garrot swung with him in silence, watching the bustling of the roads below them. He spent an amusing couple minutes watching people pass right below them, the suckers all unaware of the two wardens right above them. If Khazar did indeed cut his rope and he went tumbling, he'd probably land on one of them. It took a couple minutes before the elf broke the silence again. He sacrificed himself to save me, he said, voice thick with scorn. Who does that? Crazies. Remember Marnan? He scoffed and turned a scowl to Garrot. Why would someone do that? I treated him like crap. Why would he do that? Garrot shrugged, which made him swing a bit. He couldn't explain it either. The two settled into conspiring silence, pondering the oddities of their more heroic peers. After a couple minutes, Garrot asked, I ever tell you about Leske? Khazar glanced over at him and shook his head. Me and him were buddies since we were urchins, running through Dust Town covered in filth. We worked together under the Carta boss. Literal partners in crime, huh? Khazar gave him a weak smirk. Damn straight, and good ones too. Me and him, we were in sync. Knew how the other guy worked, so we could just give each other this look and we knew what we were gonna do. Which guys we were going to lean on, which ones we were going to swipe from, and which we were just gonna go ahead and off. Khazar snorted a laugh. Then, we got a little over our head. Our boss told us to fix a proving match, because he had money riding on this one guy. Should have been easy, we go in, drip a little poison in his opponent's waters, and get out. Except, when we got there, the guy who was supposed to win was dead stone drunk. So Leske has this idea. This awful idea. I put on the guy's armor and wallop all the highly trained warriors at their own game. Khazar laughed. I like how he volunteered you. Yep. He was crazy sometimes, but not suicidal. So he goes off with the poison, and I do my best to put on the warrior's armor. Next thing I know, I'm being ushered out into the arena and told to fight to the death. Bet that poison came in handy. Not as much as you'd think. Garrot smirked. Leske got the last guy, but the rest? That was all me. Khazar slanted him a doubtful look. How? Garrot tapped his head. Thing about warriors, they're strong, but they ain't too smart. A couple caltrops and a habit of ducking can go a long way. Khazar laughed full-throated at that. Yeah, I was pretty awesome. Problem was, Leske didn't think to tie the drunk down while I was out kicking ass. That bite you in the ass, huh? Yep. Guy stumbled out on the field just as I was being declared champion, and I was unmasked in front of the whole damn city. Being castless, yeah, we were in trouble. My boss managed to grab us before the city guard did, but that wasn't much better. Threw us in a cell all the same. Probably woulda killed us for losing him all that money, too. How'd you get out? How else? Broke out of the cell and cut a path to the door. Luck being what it is, the city guard met us at the exit, and woulda dragged me off again for defiling the proving if Duncan hadn't stepped in and claimed me for himself. Khazar smiled fondly. Funny, how often he did that. Yeah. Thing was, I had to leave Leske. He wasn't warden material. I'm not sure how he got out of trouble. I have to assume Jarvia sprang him. Jarvia. Carda's second in command. We killed the boss on the way out, but she got away. Took over the Carda, too, what with the power vacuum Birat left. As you do, Khazar agreed. After Ostagar and everything, I headed back there. Didn't have the guts to go into Dust Town, though, not when everyone there'd probably either wanna kill me or make me Paragon. Not until Belen told me to take care of the Carda for him, anyway. Image management and all that. And Leske was there, Khazar guessed. Smart kid. Yep. Sten, Morrigan, and me fought our way through their base. Ended up in the old office I'd been in 100 times, except instead of Birat and Jarvia, I was looking at Jarvia and Leske. The blighter had clawed his way right up to the second in command. Khazar was watching him now. What did you do? What could I do? Jarvia was calling her goons in, and they had a dozen traps scattered everywhere, and everyone was killing everyone. I tried to take out the traps, but Leske knew me, he knew that's what I would do, so he tried to incapacitate me while I was disarming. I woulda gone down right there if Sten hadn't saved my ass. Next thing I know, the fight's over and Leske's dead at my feet. Never even got to say goodbye to the sap. Khazar chewed his lip, and that was a weird thing to see him do. Do you wish you had? Sodding yes. Woulda given the blighter a piece of my mind, falling in with Jarvia. He was a moron if he thought she wouldn't just use him and lose him. Khazar nodded and looked back over the bay. That sucks. Yep. But funny thing is, I ain't mad at him. A curious glance. Really? Way I figure it, Leske's choices were his own. They were dumb ones, but he was just doing what he thought needed to be done to save his own ass. It's the way we dusters are. Smarter than Jowan was, at least. Garrot shrugged. He made his choice, elf. It was a dumb one, he insisted. Then, in a lower voice, it didn't even work. Garrot raised a brow at that. There's still pieces of it in me. The demon, I mean. And this, here, seemed to be the crux of what was bothering him. He twiddled his fingers, and sparks bounced between his hands. Every once in a while, I have these thoughts. They feel like they're his, but they're not. They're mine. He clenched his fists, and the sparks disappeared. It's hard to explain. Garrot grunted thoughtfully. It dangerous? I don't know. Khazar shifted his seat on the gargoyle, turning to face Garrot. I don't know what it could make me do, or think. I don't know how to control it, because it's part of me, but it comes from a demon. Khazar's voice went high and tight. Jowan killed himself for me, and it didn't fucking work. It was all for nothing. I'm still an abomination. His voice broke and he turned away abruptly, swiping his sleeve across his eyes. Garrot gave the kid a moment to compose himself. Only once the elf had gotten a couple deep breaths in and cleared his eyes did Garrot say slowly, "Seems to me, an abomination wouldn't be worried about being an abomination." Khazar's laugh was weak and cynical. "I'm serious. When that guy was in you, would you have torn yourself up over this? Come to think of it, would ya have done it before he came along, either?" After a moment of Garrot staring at him pointedly, Khazar finally shook his head. "Guess not," he mumbled. "See? Totally going soft on me, elf. Think that means you're okay?" Again, there was something like a laugh. "Not going soft? Yeah, kinda are. Guilt about your friend's death? That's pretty damn soft." Khazar smirked, swiping the last dampness out of his eyes. "Says the guy who threw out his deal with a certain dwarven king, just because a dead princess asked him to. Damn straight. I'd do it again, too." He and Khazar shared a smirk, and they settled down to stare out over the bay in companionable silence. Check the description for the links to the author.